welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to tackle one of the absolute most emotionally charged, scientifically fascinating mysteries in the entire history of human evolution. What exactly happened to all the other human species? It's a huge question, and honestly, it forces us to look really deeply at our own origins, and maybe even the potentially dark foundations of our own success.
So let's kick things off with a pretty heavy question. Did modern humans actually kill off the other human species? Like, deliberately, in a systematic way? If the answer is yes, well, that's not just some quirky historical footnote. It's a really profound statement about what humans are, about the deep, deep roots of our capacity for violence. It makes you wonder if our evolutionary progress was basically built on a foundation we'd rather not think about.
Section 1. When Earth was crowded, a planet of multiple human species. To really wrap our heads around their disappearance, we first have to picture an incredibly crowded, deep past.
Now, we are not just talking about different cultures or ethnicities here. We are talking about 5 or 6 entirely distinct biological human lineages walking the exact same landscapes, breathing the same air. Today, it's just us, but it used to be way more crowded. And our primary victims in this historical cold case, the Neanderthals, they were absolutely not primitive club-swinging brutes. Actually, scratch that. Their brains were as large as ours, sometimes even larger. They had these incredibly sophisticated Mousterian tool manufacturing techniques that required serious forward planning. We've even found fossil evidence showing they cared for their injured companions for months, they buried their dead, and they possibly even created rudimentary art. These were complex, intelligent people who successfully survived across Europe for literally 400,000 years before we even showed up.
Which brings us to Section 2, the direct violence hypothesis, the search for a smoking gun. Let's tackle the prime suspect right out of the gate, that popular, almost cinematic narrative that modern humans swept into Europe and just committed systematic, continent-wide genocide.
When you think about the timeline of events, the correlation is honestly wild. I mean, for 400,000 years, Neanderthals are out there thriving. Then, roughly 40,000 years ago, modern humans arrive in Europe in massive numbers. And shortly after, the Neanderthals just vanish from the fossil record. Poof! It's exactly what you would expect to see if our arrival directly caused their demise. But, as we all know, in science, correlation does not always equal causation. And here is the major catch. When we actually dig into the fossil record, we just don't find a smoking gun for systematic, large-scale genocide. Sure, we find bones with trauma, absolutely. But distinguishing modern human violence from, say, a hunting accident or just a fight with another Neanderthal is genuinely difficult. While violence for sure happened, the bones simply do not support this dramatic, total war hypothesis stretching over thousands of years across a massive continent. All right, Section 3, the reality of interbreeding. We didn't just fight. Now, this is where our investigation gets super complicated and throws a massive plot twist into that traditional violence narrative. Just think about this staggering number for a second, between 1 and 4%. If you have literally any non-African ancestry today, this measurable, functionally significant chunk of your DNA is strictly Neanderthal in origin. It proves our ancestors didn't just fight these other species, they successfully mated with them. At some point, a modern human and a Neanderthal had a child. That child grew up in a social group, and they passed their genes all the way down the line to you.
The really crucial point to grasp here is that a state of pure, total war is completely incompatible with this genetic reality. I mean, groups that are actively trying to mutually exterminate one another do not generally produce viable offspring together. But because that 1 to 4% is still relatively small, the limited genetic mixing points more to occasional contact. It was a relationship that was genuinely varied, sometimes hostile, sure, but sometimes peaceful. It definitely wasn't some sustained, large-scale integration of the two species.
Moving to Section 4. The invisible extinction mechanisms, disease, climate, and competition. So if it wasn't just all-out warfare, what was it? We have to pivot to the less cinematic, but honestly far deadlier mechanisms that probably caused this mass disappearance. We really have to consider the invisible killers. Think about the history of European contact with indigenous populations in the Americas. Modern humans migrating out of Africa were harboring pathogens they were completely adapted to. But those isolated Neanderthal populations, they would have had zero resistance. A modern human didn't even need to throw a spear. They just needed to carry a novel respiratory infection. And a Neanderthal who dies of a virus 3 months after contact leaves behind bones that look exactly like someone who just died of old age. The answer also likely lies in this fundamental biological principle called competitive exclusion. Basically, this means two species needing the exact same resources in the exact same landscape just cannot peacefully coexist forever. Modern humans and Neanderthals both occupied caves. We both hunted large game. We didn't even need hostile intent. We just needed to be slightly more efficient at extracting calories from the environment over thousands of years. The brutal math of population dynamics basically did the rest.
So why were we the better competitors? Honestly, it boils down to networking and tech. Our ancestors had these expansive, longer-range social networks. We know this because of the long-distance trade of materials, like shells. This meant we could rely on distant allies during lean, starving times. We also developed sophisticated projectile technology. We're talking spear throwers and bows, which let us hunt from a distance with way lower physical risk than Neanderthals, whose anatomy was built for super dangerous close-range ambush hunting. We simply outcompeted them, slowly driving them into marginal, unviable territories.
Section 5. Denisovans and the Hobbit. Extinction across ecosystems. Let's broaden the scope of this explainer a bit and look at the other victims in this cold case. How did these invisible mechanisms play out across entirely different ecosystems?
When we start comparing our ancient cousins, we see incredibly diverse vulnerabilities. While Neanderthals slowly declined across a massive continent due to competition and disease, just look at Homo floresiensis, the Hobbit. They were completely isolated on the island of Flores in Indonesia. Island populations are tiny and drastically more vulnerable to introduce diseases or direct competition for limited resources. Their extinction probably happened way faster than the Neanderthals. Or, who knows, perhaps a volcanic eruption wiped them out before we even got there. And then you have the Denisovans, spanning Asia and Oceania, who we know almost entirely just from their DNA rather than physical fossils.
And what's absolutely mind-blowing here is the legacy those Denisovans left behind. We know they interbred with modern humans because their DNA persists today, especially in Asian and Oceanian populations. But it's not just junk DNA. They actually gifted us a functional genetic cheat code for high-altitude adaptation. Every single time a modern Tibetan athlete runs a marathon in the incredibly thin air of a high mountain, they are quite literally running on the surviving biology of the extinct Denisovans. They might be gone, but they are absolutely not entirely absent.
Section 6. The last humans standing. A messy absorption. We've reached the final chapter of our explainer, and the resolution to this 40,000-year-old mystery is honestly far more unsettling than some clean, heroic victory. Ultimately, the extinction of the other humans wasn't a deliberate, organized extermination. It was just a really messy, diffuse process. We exposed them to novel diseases. We outcompeted them for food because we had better technology and wider social networks. And yeah, we interbred with them. They were marginally absorbed right into our own lineage just before fading away completely. I really want to leave you with this final, provocative thought. For hundreds of thousands of years, there were other minds. There were other ways of being human. Other beings who looked up at the exact same stars and buried their dead. Now they are irretrievably gone, and we are the only ones left standing, carrying a tiny piece of their ghosts right in our DNA. Whether we deserve to carry that legacy, or whether they'd consider it an insult, is a question science just can't answer. But understanding exactly how they vanished helps us understand who we are today. Thanks so much for exploring this incredible journey with me.
All right, welcome to this explainer. I want you to imagine a time, and I mean literally, not just metaphorically, when Earth was crowded. There was a moment in the deep past when we shared this planet with at least 5 or 6 different human species, all living here at the exact same time. We're not talking about different cultures here. We're talking about entirely distinct biological lineages separated by hundreds of thousands of years of evolution. You've got Homo sapiens, Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo floresiensis, the Hobbit, and honestly, probably others we haven't even dug up yet. But today, it's just us. So, what exactly happened to everyone else?
Okay, let's dive into this, because this framing totally dominates the popular consciousness, right? And we really need to take it seriously. Did modern humans deliberately, systematically eliminate the Neanderthals? It's a profound, kind of dark question, because if the answer is yes, well, it makes a glaring statement about the deepest roots of human violence. It forces us to ask if what looks like our grand evolutionary progress is actually built on something incredibly dark that we'd really rather not think about.
To even begin to answer that, we first have to totally shatter a massive misconception. The popular myth loves to paint Neanderthals as these cognitively simple, primitive brutes who were just effortlessly wiped out by vastly superior invaders. But look at the fossil reality. It tells a completely different story. Neanderthals were successfully living across Europe and Western Asia for 400,000 years. They had brains as large as ours and, honestly, sometimes even larger. They had what's called the complex Mousterian tool industry, meaning they were crafting advanced, highly specialized stone tools that required some intense planning, and they buried their dead. Incredibly, their skeletons show healed injuries that would have literally required weeks or even months of dedicated care from others. By any reasonable definition, they were people.
But despite all that complexity and resilience, the fossil record throws us this deeply unsettling timeline. Check this out. Approximately 40,000 years ago, modern humans arrive in Europe in significant numbers. And then, very shortly after, the Neanderthals just vanish. And this isn't a one-off. This pattern repeats across their entire geographic range. It's a stark, undeniable correlation. And honestly, it's exactly what you'd expect to see if our arrival was the direct cause of their disappearance. That timeline right there is exactly what fueled the whole direct violence hypothesis in the first place.
But you know as well as I do, correlation is definitely not causation. When we actually go looking for hard proof of some continent-wide extermination, the evidence really falls short. Yes, okay, there are Neanderthal skeletal remains that show bone trauma, but here's the catch, and it's a big one. Distinguishing interspecies violence, meaning a modern human actually attacked a Neanderthal, from violence caused by other Neanderthals, or even just regular hunting accidents, it's genuinely difficult. There's absolutely no smoking gun in the fossil record proving some systematic, large-scale genocide.
Now, what's really interesting about this next piece of the puzzle is that it completely shatters this idea of a pure, total war of extermination. And the proof is actually hiding inside us right now. If you have any ancestry from outside of sub-Saharan Africa, between 1% and 4% of your DNA is Neanderthal in origin. It's literally right there in your genome today. No way around it. This fundamentally proves that modern humans and Neanderthals didn't just fight. They met, they interacted, and they produced offspring who survived and went on to reproduce. So this interbreeding reality forces us to completely rethink this history. Groups engaged in a systematic mutual extermination don't typically produce viable offspring together, right? However, that relatively small percentage of Neanderthal DNA suggests this wasn't exactly a total harmonious integration either. Instead, it points to occasional, varied contact spread out across thousands of years. Sometimes hostile, sure, but sometimes peaceful. And crucially, we absorbed something useful from them before ultimately replacing them. We actually inherited beneficial gene variants for crucial things like immune function and metabolism.
So, this brings us to a massive puzzle. If it wasn't just a brutal, continent-wide war of direct physical violence, what on earth actually wiped out these complex, large-brained humans who had successfully survived the Ice Age for hundreds of thousands of years? Well, we have to look beyond the battlefield. We have to look into the hidden, multi-factor mechanisms of extinction that the fossil record barely even captures. First up on that list are the invisible killers. Disease gets very little popular attention in this debate, but it might have absolutely been the most lethal weapon of all. See, modern humans migrating out of Africa were carrying novel pathogens, stuff they'd already developed some resistance to. But Neanderthals, they'd been living in total isolation from those specific pathogen environments, making them a completely naive population. It's the exact same devastating epidemiological dynamic we saw when European contact caused massive, catastrophic mortality among indigenous populations in the Americas. A modern human didn't need to throw a spear to carry death. And the scariest part about this theory, a respiratory infection leaves exactly zero recognizable trace on a fossilized bone.
Beyond disease, we have this slow, quiet mechanism of ecology called competitive exclusion. Now, this is just the basic biological principle that two species competing for the exact same ecological niche cannot stably coexist in the long run. Think about it. We both hunted large game, we both needed the exact same caves and shelters, and we both utilized the exact same landscapes. Modern humans didn't necessarily need to physically fight the Neanderthals at all. They just needed to be slightly better at getting food consistently over a span of thousands of years. And the math of those population dynamics becomes pretty obvious when we put these competitive advantages side by side. So the crucial point here is that Homo sapiens had much larger social networks spanning vast distances. That gave us a massive information advantage, plus a built-in backup plan during lean times. We also developed projectile technology, think spear throwers and eventually bows, which allowed us to hunt from a safe distance. Neanderthals, on the other hand, relied on highly physical, close-range, super risky hunting.
Add in the severe climate instability of the time, and modern humans effectively just drove Neanderthals into unviable marginal territories through sheer relentless attrition.
But hey, this story isn't just restricted to Europe and the Neanderthals. If we shift our focus over to Asia, we run into the Denisovans. They are arguably the most mysterious of all the extinct human species. Why? Because practically their entire physical existence is known from just a single finger bone and a tooth discovered in a Siberian cave back in the early 2000s. We don't have full skeletons of these guys. We know them almost exclusively through their surviving DNA. Yet, despite that lack of bones, their genetic legacy is absolutely immense. Denisovan DNA is found scattered right across modern human populations in Asia and Oceania today, with the highest concentrations showing up in Aboriginal Australians and Papua New Guineans. So they interbred with us, and they even interbred with Neanderthals. But here is the absolute most fascinating part of this. They left behind some incredibly specific beneficial genes. Whenever a Tibetan marathon runner competes in that thin, freezing mountain air, their adaptation to that extreme high altitude is quite literally driven by Denisovan biology left over from ancient interbreeding. How wild is that?
Let's move to our next example and see how this builds a picture of a truly global phenomenon. Down on the island of Flores in Indonesia, there lived Homo floresiensis. They were nicknamed the Hobbit because of their small stature. And this totally unique species survived there for hundreds of thousands of years until roughly 50,000 years ago. And guess what? Right around that exact time, right when modern humans arrived in the region, the fossil record for the Hobbit goes completely silent. This brilliantly illustrates the vast differences in exactly how these ancient humans met their end. On one hand, you've got the continental attrition of the Neanderthals, that slow squeeze of competition across massive landscapes over thousands of years. But on the other hand, we see island vulnerability. Small, isolated populations like the Hobbit were just incredibly susceptible to change. Their disappearance could have been a rapid collapse triggered by modern human-introduced diseases, sudden competition for extremely limited resources, or honestly, even just a massive volcanic eruption on the island. The contexts were wildly different, but the ultimate outcome, exactly the same.
Now, I want us to pause for a second and look at something that science really struggles to answer, but that genetics absolutely forces us to confront. What were the actual, lived social realities of these ancient encounters? We know for a fact interbreeding happened. That means, at some point, a modern human and a Neanderthal or a Denisovan had a child. Just imagine that child growing up in a social group where they looked visibly different from everyone else. Were they accepted? Were they rejected? Was the encounter that produced them consensual or was it violent? The bones and the stones are completely, frustratingly silent on these deeply human experiences.
So when we pull all of this scattered evidence together, what we are left with is what I like to call the uncomfortable extinction. It is definitely not a clean story of natural guilt-free replacement, nor is it some simple cinematic story of organized evil genocide. It's a messy, highly contextually variable history. We introduced deadly diseases. We relentlessly outcompeted them for resources with better tech and tighter social networks. We very likely occasionally killed them directly. And we absorbed their most beneficial genes right before they faded away forever.
There is a profound tragedy here that we often just gloss over. The world we live in right now, where being human means only one thing biologically, it's an anomaly. For most of the last 500,000 years, there were other minds out there, other specific, valid ways of experiencing the world. Consider this: a Neanderthal sitting by a fire in a cave in what is now France, caring for an injured companion, was doing something recognizably human. But the lineage that fire belongs to is entirely gone. That completely different human experience of looking out at those ancient landscapes, it is irretrievably lost.
Which ultimately leads us here. The others disappeared, and we remained. But we carry a small piece of them in our DNA. It is literally the only living monument they have left on this earth. And so I want to leave you with this final question to ponder. Considering exactly how we outcompeted, displaced, and effectively erased them from the planet, is the DNA we carry an honoring legacy, or is it the ultimate insult? The relationship between our survival and their disappearance truly remains the most uncomfortable question in the history of our species. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I will see you next time.